This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight. I'm Sam Alaimo. Welcome to the Nobel Podcast. I have Don Vandergriff, Army tank officer, 25 years, author of several books, including Outcomes-Based Learning and Raising the Bar, and he specializes in military leadership and training. Don, welcome to the Nobel Podcast.
Sam, I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Let's start from the very beginning. Where did you grow up?
I grew up an Air Force brat, and I actually, after my parents passed away in 2005 and 3, I found out I was adopted in England, and no one in the family ever told me. They were sworn not to. They had their reasons. I didn't know, and it didn't matter. They were good parents. But I was born in Covington, England. They adopted me after 1 year old, and I found out in 2005 that I was adopted. And then I grew up largely in Amarillo and Fort Worth, Texas, and in Tennessee from 6th grade onward through college. I grew up in East Tennessee, and I'm glad I did because I'm a big outdoors nut and a big Civil War. That's not my specialty in grad and post-grad, but I love the American Civil War like as a secondary passion.
That's interesting. I haven't met too many people who were adopted in those circumstances. Your life would have been radically different had you stayed in England. Do you know what the circumstances of that are?
No, I don't. Well, they never told me. The family was just sworn. I met with some cousins and then aunts and uncles later, and they said they were sworn not to tell me, and it wasn't a big deal to me. And I tried to research it, and then I just gave up because I had so much stuff going on. That I did find that my true biological mother's still alive, and I just never reached out. She's still in Covington, so it wasn't. As I did more of it, just didn't become a big deal. So
Interesting. So what was your childhood like? Was it pretty rural? Was it urban?
it was a combination of both. My family always tended to live right on the edge of the country, whatever suburbs were called in the 70s and early 80s. But whenever I could, I was outside, and whenever I could, I was in the woods. And I did a lot of Civil War reenacting when I was a teenager, and I joined a couple of really authentic groups, so I learned how to do it right. And that kind of cast a mold. My dad was the same way. He was a junior high principal and junior high coach on baseball and football. He was really good. And he earned his way through undergraduate and graduate by being an auto mechanic. And my mom was a nursing assistant, and they always encouraged me to get out and do things and try. And they weren't afraid to tell me learn through failure. And I did. We were always lower middle class, never had money, it seemed. Matter of fact, when my dad was going through grad school and undergraduate when I was a little kid, we had our power shut off, our water shut off a few times because they couldn't pay the bills, and then they managed to do it. So I know what it's like struggling and then learning how to manage money and so forth. The biggest thing is work hard and be honest. My dad would say, I don't care what you want to be or do, just do the best you can. And I always had an inkling to be in the military. No one can understand why. I can't understand why. But from the time I was in elementary school, I would save my lunch money and go buy the little plastic drugstore soldiers and tanks and trucks. And I had like boxes of them. It was amazing what I would sacrifice lunch to buy these things. And in Amarillo, Texas, for 5 years we lived there, we had a vacant lot next to our Adobe looking rental house. And I would play in that. I had it all dug up and looked like a battlefield. So I was in, and then I started reading when I was in second grade. My first big book was the Civil War, Pictorial History of the Civil War, the centennial version of the Civil War. And I still remember it. But at the same time, I grew up near friends who had horses and animals. So I grew up riding horses and even had a couple of summer jobs where I had to do a Civil War artillery with horses. And so, again, always outdoors, but doing military history.
You had a really cool pivot from Marine Corps to Army. So it sounds like you always wanted to be in the military.
Yeah.
I guess what was the decision process at that young age of wanting to become a Marine?
Well, what happened was my dad wanted me to fly jets, and I did. It was funny. I was in the middle of my high school class, GPA wise, but was one of the top. We didn't do the SAT. We did the ACT in the 80-81 when I was senior in high school and junior. And I was like, a matter of fact, the guidance counselor was good friends with my dad. The high school was across the street from the junior high, which made it for a tough circumstance having your dad right across the street. So you had to watch your P's and Q's all the time. But my counselor called me in and said, "You're one of the biggest surprises because you're in the middle. You're a 2.99 GPA in high school, but you're like number 2 or top 1% of the ACT score. I've always been able to take tests well, but unless I'm part of the learning, lecture does not do me any good." So it's one of the reasons I dove into learning and learning theory and mental theory and how the mind works and how the mind learns, because I have seen so many PME, professional military education classes and courses that could be so much better if they really knew learning theory. So that was always in the back. I know every military guy that does a podcast with me that hosts it, we get into that because they're like, man, I ask my audiences, what is one thing you could change about your learning in the military if you could? And they all raise their hands and says, just get rid of the lecture and the PowerPoint obsession. And that's about 99% of the people in there. And so that's one of the reasons I delve into that, because I'm like, and even in college, the same way, I was at 2.99 there and did good. And, later on went to grad school and post grad, but it was just it was all lecture and study centric. And I said, I know there's a better way to learn.
Yeah, when I was digging into your material, it seems like death by PowerPoint takes on a new meaning.
Yeah.
Where you're literally not training to prevent death in some circumstances. You're training to uptake knowledge through PowerPoint.
Yeah.
What was your first job in the Marine Corps? How old were you? And then how did you end up in the Army?
Yeah, what was funny, my dad wanted me to fly jets, and because of my ACT scores, we went up to apply for. I wanted to go to University of Tennessee because my dad had gone there for a year. He'd gone there and played football his freshman year, but he also had great grades, and they said be pre-med and play football, and the two don't mix. And so he got frustrated, dropped out, and went in the Air Force for 13 years. This was in the 50s. And he wanted me to go join and get a scholarship for Air Force ROTC. So we went up there and we had an interview with the professor of military science in the fall of 80, and I was graduating in 81. And he looked and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to fly jets if I make it. I know it's tough." And really, in the back of my mind, I wanted to lead soldiers or Marines or whatever. I wanted to be a combat fighter, a close combat fighter, but I was willing to give it a try. And the guy said, "Well, based on your math scores in high school, which were the only high scores I had, and based on your ACT scores, we want to make you a math major or engineering major. And normally you'll go science, you won't fly." It was the way he said it, and my dad didn't say anything. He was sitting right there, and I said, "Well, sir, if that's the case, I'll go try something else." My father would not talk to me the entire 2-hour drive from Knoxville back to Chattanooga. He didn't say much at all. And I went out right after that and did early enlistment in the Marine Corps because I knew I needed the structure and the discipline and a challenge that the Marine could offer me. But I also had some medical issues. I had flat feet and I had very severe sinus issues. I don't know how I got through the medical stuff, but I did. But this would later come back to haunt me, especially when I tried going into any kind of area like you guys with diving and anything else. The pressure, my sinuses would just blow up on me. So I went through Paris Island. The day after I graduated high school, I was gone because I didn't like the social atmosphere of high school. Everything was facade. Everything was made up. The leadership was based on who was the biggest and handsomest or prettiest and had the money. And I'd never been I'm not a communist. I'm a free market, small government Republican. I love merit-based everything. That's why I love you guys. I work, like I said, with a lot of SEALs. I love that kind of atmosphere. But what I can't stand is the facade of what society's become. And I saw the inkling there. So I graduated on one day, and then the next day I was flying down to Charleston, South Carolina, where they pick you up and going into Paris Island. I went into the reserves because they had a 0300 slot, and I knew I was going to school at Tennessee, so I was going to do the reserves and then go into Marine Platoon Leadership Development Program. And so that was my plan, and then become an infantry officer in the Marine Corps or Force Recon or whatever. And then I got into it, and I've always liked tanks or infantry. I didn't care which one. And I did a year in the reserves there. I went through Paris Island and then the infantry training after that, reported to school in December of 81, quarter, and they started running these mini quarters that would go over the month-long Christmas break and spring break. You could take full hours, but you had to go to school all day, 5 days a week. So I was a relentless workhorse. And so I did that. And then I got one of my reenacting friends was in the Army ROTC. Two of them were, and they said, look, you've already got prior service just by going through, advanced infantry training at Camp Geiger down at Lejeune and then Paris Island. And then you've been in the reserves for a year. They're really desperate. The Army's expanding, and the local unit, you would be a sergeant in the National Guard, and it's a tank unit. And I'm like, that's what I really want to do. So I got my release from the Marine Corps Fourth Marine Division and went over and joined ROTC and joined the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment. And I joined a tank unit who had their own training area, about 500 acres for the 6 or 7 tanks they actually had there. And it worked out good. So the way I looked at it is the Marine Corps had 2.5 battalions of tanks, and the Army had like 27 to 30 at the time. So the opportunities to do, I was a fan of Patton growing up, fantasized about being the future Patton or whatever. So I wanted to do tanks if I didn't do infantry. So that's the route I went.
Rock and roll. And you ended up 25 years as a tank officer, went around the world. I mean, I want to get into your ideas, so maybe we'll try to wrap up the military, but like if you could summarize what was the best aspect of your 25 years in the military and then offset by the worst.
I had that question the other day I've joined the VFW in August, and I'm glad we did. My wife and I did. I got asked that same question. I said, it's comradeship. So I cannot stand meta, or I don't mind being openly political because that's my view. I welcome other contrasting views as long as they're well explained. But I can't stand Mark Zuckerberg and Meta on Facebook because he's made a lot of money being a capitalist and free enterprise, and he doesn't want anybody else to do that. But I only stay on Facebook because of the hundreds of contacts with comrades that I've met over my adult life. I mean, in high school, the people in high school I did get along with, I'm actually friends with everybody because their opinion of me was a lot higher than my own opinion of myself. And some of them said, you're not the richest guy at all, but you're the most successful guy. And I say, I just do it because I want to make people better. So that's the best thing about it, comradeship, regardless of the branch, regardless of the specialty. And then the worst thing is the leadership, the hypocrisy. So you take an oath to the Constitution, you're supposed to be, the values of the military are selfless service. And I see the reason I wrote a lot of my books because I see selfish service. I see it's all about me and promotion, self-promotion, putting me before my guys. That's the worst part. For every great boss I had a bad boss.
We're going to cover that when we start getting into your ideas. So let's go to, I'm curious, the first step. What did you do immediately post-military? Is that when you kind of built your education platform you're on right now?
Sam, I started actually going into reform. I forgot who the guy was. I apologize. Back in 97, wrote an article about me because I was just starting to do my work in 1997. He interviewed my wife, and my wife said his work is the other woman. But what she said was, I was doing great in the military. I went to the Gulf War as a company commander, came back with, great personnel evaluations. We call them officer evaluation reports in the Army. And I was sent to Amphibious Warfare School to represent the Army at the Marine Corps for 10 months. I was number 2 in the class of 187 people. I was the first student instructor they ever had there because I was practicing those things I'd been taught. And I read the Maneuver Warfare Handbook in 1985, written by Bill Lynn. And Bill and I just rewrote the handbook last year to an updated version. But I started when I got this, I told this colonel who was my brigade commander something he didn't want to hear. And I was only under him for 3 months when I got back from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And I was evaluated by another colonel who was over me in the combat task force. And I got a great report from him for 6 months. and I had been put right in command off the plane, as they say. I was not even in a staff job like a lot of captains do, because they thought I was just going to accelerate. And I did when I went to the Desert Storm, Positive Force, which is the operation after Desert Storm. And I get back and I tell this guy something he doesn't want to hear, and he gives me what's called a senior raider option OER. Didn't even need to do it. He just did it because in spite, to spite me. And I got a what's called a 2 block. You got blocks and 1, 2, 3, and all the way down. And most of the blocks are 1 or 2. But because I got such a great glaring report, the Army is all full of 0 defects. So everything's inflated. But if you go to like I did and did great on the initial report and then get a degrade, what's called a degrade in performance, it's worse than getting an all right OER at the first and then climbing. So it's like me getting a DUI basically today. I mean, for what? For doing what the Army told me was right in their ethics. Wasn't disrespectful. I just told him something he didn't want to hear. And everyone warned me not to do that because he was a yes man person. And the amount of rear end kissing that I saw in that command was horrible. But anyway, long story short, as I was going to get out, come home, I said, I'll be a state trooper. I'll find something else to do. And my wife said, everyone, it was in the drawdown in the 90s after the Gulf War. And my wife told me, and she sometimes regrets it now. She said, everyone else is kicking the can down the road. Why don't you write about what just happened to you and try to fix it? I went back. I got 2 more commands. I had 52 months of command time, which is an irony. And except for that one OER, they're all above water. But the Army saw that one exception, and I never went as a resident to command and staff call all the necessary steps. So I started diving into my work and reading more about things outside military history. And it was always one of my brigade commanders that was great after this guy, Joe Krozik. He just passed away 2 years ago. But Joe Krozik taught us that everything you do before you get to the ready line on the gunnery, you have the gunnery tower and then you cross the ready line and you start firing. But he says, I can tell how good you're going to be by everything you do before the ready line. So I started translating that into leader development. 99% of all your military history is about the battles and campaigns, great and bad. You learn just as much from bad as you do from good. But I went, what makes these guys great or what makes them bad before they get there? So I started studying culture and learning and personal management systems, all the things that serve to shape a culture, getting into how people perform and what they did in peacetime and how the system treated them, because it was what they did before they got to that ready line, which was going into combat, which foretold how they were going to do largely most of the time. As you and I know, thorough preparation, realistic preparation prepares you for, because you're not going to suddenly wake up and be an Audie Murphy. So I started getting into that after what happened to me, because it made no sense. The Army said they wanted to be all the services to practice high ethical conduct, moral courage, and all that. They preached it. And when I did, and then I appealed that 1 3-month report, not once, but twice. The second time I appealed it, my neighbor was what was called the first personnel command chief in Heidelberg, Germany. We were in Sullivan Barracks, Mannheim, Germany, but all the villages were in one location. And he said, he looked over my packet and said, this is the best appeal packet ever. I had like 9 statements from fellow officers and NCOs that said, this guy's the best commander in the brigade. He just practiced moral courage. Guess what the Army did with that appeal? Nothing. Both appeals, they did nothing. Well, they blacked out his part. But when a board looks at that, they can still see it's something wrong with it. That's how they look at everything. So because of my wife, I said, she's right. I love being a soldier. I love being a Marine. I love being a soldier. I love being a combat arms guy. I'm going to do something about this because it's affecting other people. And it creates an entire atmosphere of careerists. And later on, I would start meeting similar people, like the acolytes that hang out with John Boyd, and they started shaping me and mentoring me to refine my work and make it more academic and more presentable to the public. So that's how I got to where I'm at now.
So I got like a bunch of specific questions about your work, but is the broadest umbrella to start with kind of a broad definition of outcomes based learning? Is that the highest point?
Outcomes-based learning was created by me after plagiarizing the hell out of the Germans before World War II and World War One. I self-taught German. I'm talking to a guy, and I'm playing a war game with a German in Germany right now. He's helping me practice my German. My wife does good with German. She helped me translate a lot. She worked for a German travel agency while we were in Germany, and everything was in German. But you take away the myths of the Nazism and the top-down stuff. They had the best education system up through World War One until Hitler basically destroyed it in the 30s of developing adaptive leaders and leaders of character. So go back to your original question. I develop outcomes-based learning on how to develop people to perform under what I consider the superior command culture, which is mission command. The Army and Marines, they preach mission command like crazy, but then they develop people for it like they were doing the industrial age, like for attritional warfare. It makes no sense. So OBL is the way to develop people for mission command.
Can you define mission command?
Yeah, mission command is the culture of empowerment. And the purpose of mission command is develop fast OODA loops at all levels, because your OODA loop, the lower you go, the faster your OODA loop is. The OODA loop is the guy or gal at the front has the best feel for what's going on, despite GPSs and computerized screens and drones and all that. They still have the best feel for the battle. And mission command is the culture of empowerment, the culture of empowerment to leaders that have the strength of character to do the right thing regardless of the impacts on them. And that means making the right decision in the face of the enemy, in the face of superiors, their own men, and their peers, meaning they're doing the right thing regardless of the effect of that. That's a horrible translation of the German definition of what's called Aufstiegstaktik, which is our bad translation of mission command from Aufstiegstaktik. But that term developed under Frederick the Great and was brought back by Moltke the Great in 1858 when he looked. His first order for the major field exercises they did every year was 778 pages. And he said, the only thing we have going for us in Prussia is great leadership. And we don't have it right now because we're surrounded by enemies that have more material, more manpower, and more time. So he says, I need to develop a military that has the best leadership, that act decisively. And he had some clues of that because of the work of Gerhard Sarnhurst in the Napoleonic era. Gerhard Sarnhurst was the father of mission command and Aufstiegstaktik in the Prussian army. And he did that because in 1806 at a place called Jena Arestadt, which is now in today's former East Prussia, in October 1806, Napoleon destroyed the Prussian army and pursued it, and 6 weeks later overran all of Prussia. Why did he do this? Because the Prussian army started the war with this great myth of Frederick the Great from the 1750s and 60s, and they had great discipline and great cavalry, but they were too disciplined and too obedient to orders. They they focused more on parade ground style over substance. And Scharnhorst in 1803 began the military Gesellschaft, which is German translation of military study groups. And those study groups began, and there's a guy, one of my professors, my best one, Dr. Charles White, wrote the biography. He was a Fulbright scholar in Germany. He wrote his biography on Scharnhorst, and it's a great book. If you have not read it, you need to, because it's incredible what that guy accomplished. He got a wound in the foot in the 1813 campaign in central Germany and died of an infection as chief of staff of the Prussian army there that was fighting Napoleon. But it all focused on leader development and unique ways of learning. He was doing this in the early 1800s. And when Moltke the Elder, Helmut von Moltke the Elder, came in to chief of staff in 1858, he took the work that Scharnhorst and his disciples were doing and started implementing it at the cadet level all the way up, changing how they learned and everything. It took a while because there was a lot of resistance to it, but he got it implemented, and it bore fruit in the wars of 1866 and 1870, when in a matter of no time, the Prussians defeated both Austria and then later France in just weeks. Because the main reason was they were empowering leaders at the front to make decisions. If the original order was false, they didn't have to wait for a change. They just made it. And the armies they fought were just the opposite. They did not do anything unless they were ordered to do it.
So you're talking about like pre-30s Germany coming at it from a different angle. Do you think it was more viable then to trust the boots on the ground at the front because they didn't have electronic communications and they couldn't control micro movements? Do you think it was easier for them to do it than it is for us to do it now in 2024?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. But most armies didn't. We came into the war as the American army. We came in as disciples of the French, and the French approach to learning from World War I was to do the opposite of the Germans. The French they developed the doctrine of methodical battle, and it's the French translation of bataille méthodique, where everything was controlled. And so I wrote a couple of reviews. I wrote a couple of Armor magazine articles in the late 90s. And guys, like, this is like direct translation out of the French manual of 1932, the methodical battle, which we copied verbatim in 1933. And it was exactly trying to take technology and control it more. So you're exactly right. The Germans found the solution, but more importantly, they found a way to teach people how to do it and then set up a culture that embodied it and encouraged it. There was a lot of things I talk about in all my books about how they did it. That would be another whole essay and session. Main thing, they embodied and grasped and operated under the chaos of battle that you and I know about more so than anybody. They accepted it and they built an army that could deal with it. Everyone else tried to control the chaos. And when you try to control the chaos, it makes it worse. So now that we have even more electronic and more control, and then we add in political correctness, where it's equity of outcome, not equity at the start, you have more control measures than ever before. Now today, you and I are still finding out. I get intel updates on classified every day from a wealth of sources because I know so many people. And the Russians went into the Ukrainian war trying to control everything because they had that top-down culture. The Ukrainians initially won, my argument, the first days of the Russian attack because they had a mission command defense. My stuff was already over there in 2014 that was starting to be used about how to do it. It's very easy to implement mission command on defense. It's not very easy to do it on the offense. But my point is, the biggest lessons learned coming out of this war is, one, you can't concentrate. You can't have the traditional tactical operations center with the big tents and the tracks and all that, which we still do because drones and precision fires are taken out. So instead of using technology to disperse and pass on information like the headsets where you could disperse your staff and they could brief each other over the headsets and then scramble the message, we are still trying to counter it by electronic warfare and ways to shield the current industrial age culture. So, because people are not dumb. They realize to do what Vandergriff is calling for would mean a total remake of the military. And I think it would be worth it from my now 30 years plus of studying and interviewing thousands of people, that it would be worth doing it. But the problem is it gets into a lot of the people that have succeeded because of the system, not in spite of it.
The general theme throughout what you're talking about is the unwillingness for leadership to change, the lack of admitting that they need to change. And you talk about the difference between being taught what to think versus being taught how to think.
Yep.
I wonder, at some point, something's going to force us to get back to teaching how to think. And instead of waiting for war, my question to you is, how do you actually convince a pretty stagnant senior leadership to do it now, to teach people how to think now? And is it really realistic to do it at the sort of scale you see in the U.S. military?
I don't think it's going to happen until we're largely defeated, some kind of defeat, and maybe too late then. And the other thing, too, is when you create an organization of thinkers, that can think for themselves and make decisions for themselves, then you flatten the organization, but it also takes away a power from a hierarchical organization. Okay, because they don't need all the hierarchy to get things accomplished that you can do when you have a flatter organization. The things that I advocate, while they work and they have scientific and historical evidence, they're most likely not going to be implemented unless it's a drastic emergency. Now, with that, the reason I don't quit my after my bout with PTSD, because all my time in Afghanistan and other places, and dealing with a culture that hated my guts, largely always backstabbed me, was I focus on non-military organizations, and I also focus on law enforcement and fire departments. The company I work with, Numertes, does like a workshop every couple of months for somebody, and the feedback is absolutely incredible. They love it, and we're just seeing us do more of that. But the workshop is exactly the way we want to see things. Nothing is lecture, nothing is PowerPoint. It's all problem solving, always empowerment, and they can fail and learn from it. And the worst thing that can be to happen to them is maybe being embarrassed and laughed at. That's about it. We create a climate of what I call a painful climate of understanding failure. And that's what you need. You need to get rid of zero defects. You need to let people be able to learn from their mistakes and know why they made a mistake within the context of a scientific and historical explanation.
You hit on this need to pivot the relationship between the leaders and the men and women in the field. And one of the things you talk about is the willingness to question authority, which I love. I was reading something about the samurai the other day, and they would never disagree with their senior leaders. They would actually commit suicide as a way to show them their disagreements, because they wouldn't actually just verbally say it. They had to die to prove their point. So obviously that's an extreme example, but when you talk about instilling willingness to question authority, that's on the boots on the ground side. But then the senior leadership actually has to be open minded enough and trusting enough and humble enough to actually listen to it. So my question is more practical. How do you actually institute that in an organization that doesn't want it?
What you've got to do is, and this is what the Ukrainians are going through. I talked to their chief of PME over there infrequently, but he has posted pictures on Facebook of them translating my books and briefings and stuff, which has been cool. But they still are a evolution of a top down culture, and then they have NATO, which is all top down as well, advising them. One of the things I tell my audience is I always ask, who's a biology major, and maybe you have one person in the whole group, and I say, so what kind of organization lives or survives over hundreds or thousands of years? And the person eventually goes, or someone else goes, oh, they evolve. Well, let's look at an organization. The most effective organizations in history, most effective businesses, and this is where Mark and I really share a lot of data. Mark's done some great case studies on failed organizations, but they fail to adapt. They fail to evolve. Okay. So you look at the translation, there's a great close friend of mine, Dr. Bruce Goodmanson, but he has really in detail showed the evolution of the German army, both culturally and structurally, from the period of Helmuth von Moltke to World War II, particularly in World War One. But what you see is their willingness to try new things as long as they learn from them. And the other thing that's interesting is you look at the guys that wrote the scathing review of World War One for the German army, and they were captains and majors and some NCOs. You wouldn't see that in any other army. They said, here's the guys that were there. They're smart guys, but regardless of their rank, we want them to do the study. When von Schick became the chief of staff in 1919, that's what he orchestrated, a thorough review of what they did wrong. You wouldn't see a lot of other militaries do that. What did we do wrong so we get better, you know? And so when you're asking that question, so every time we do the workshop, Sam, for anybody, like we did it for Nevers, the Northern Virginia emergency. They do all the first responders in Northern Virginia. They were having me back in April. And then we did the New York City Police Counterterrorism Group in the fall. I did that private group. What you have all the people that attend the workshop is, please give this to our senior leaders. Please make them go through. I did the DC Fire Department, the DC Police Department a couple of years ago separately. And they all said the same thing, man, this is great, but you need to make our senior leaders go through it because they're making us wait to make decisions till they get there. I mean, it's horrible what they're going through. Like I looked at the Valverde shooting a couple years ago where, the elementary school got shot up down in South Texas. And it didn't take me a lot, but the final report did say this. It was all because no one would make a decision when they got there. They were all taught through, it don't even have to be a direct teach. It could be, oh, I saw that guy did this that was not within policy and he got fired, he got demoted, he lost his pension. So I'm not going to do anything anymore. And what you had in that situation with hundreds of police from different departments showing up was no one was willing to take charge, take responsibility. And no one was, even though they saw the thing going on in there, was willing to take a risk to go in there and do the right thing. So how did you see a big change? Well, you remember that shooting was a year ago in Nashville at the private school? I studied that too. So they learned from that Valverde thing. They made a policy change. If you're the first policeman on the ground, the first one got there within 8 minutes of the first report going out. You have to have one other guy because, as you know, when you do room clearing, you don't do it by yourself, okay? Or do a building clearing. You got to have at least backup. So they said as soon as you get the second officer there, you guys can go in. You don't have to wait for a supervisor. Think about that. That's a small change. So when we do the workshop, we also did one for some kind of energy agency out in Idaho in March. And they have a guy that's in a pretty key position that reads all this stuff. He's trying to figure out a way to implement this change of culture. So you got to find a person or an action that's an advocacy for it. Because believe me, I've had Army and Marine courses buy into this, and then the guy that was behind it left or retired, and it went back to the old way. It really did. So again, to your larger question, how are we going to implement this? Again, I'm afraid to say that unless we suffer a major defeat. That's why my book in 2002, and then I rewrote in 2013, Path to Victory, America's Army and the Revolution in Human Affairs, was all about reforming the personnel system, management system, how to create the award system, promotions, and punishment systems to create a culture of mission command. That's what the book was about. And I won a lot of awards. I got a lot of good dang big kudos. I was on the cover of Army Times twice, but as soon as that top cover left, I was out of there because it's going to take decades to change over the rot. There's so much rot in the system. Our drastic purge, again, they should put professionalism and meritocracy first. That's it. And nothing else matters because human nature doesn't work the other way.
Let's shift locations on the globe a little bit. Let's look at Ukraine and Taiwan. Ukraine obviously had to fix itself right quick. Taiwan's looking at potentially one of the most significant armies on earth in terms of numbers. You're working with both of them. You dropped both those countries' names. Can you talk about how they're employing your work right now?
Ukrainians use all my stuff. They even, right after the war started, the DOD, a colonel in DOD, said, the Ukrainians are using your stuff. Here's their briefings on it in Ukrainian. So for two reasons, the Ukrainians have wanted to hire me, but NATO won't let them do it. And the other reason is I've just gone through counseling for PTSD. And then my wife, when I was away in Afghanistan for 6 years, she was waking up every morning like, was he involved in this? Just made a conscious decision. Is they can use my work, they can email me, which they do, with questions, and I help them out because I'm always into you give something back for all the great things I've been blessed with.
Do you think that, like Ukraine, in the trenches, for example, where they kind of necessarily have to be offset sometimes, leadership, boots on the ground, though they do have incredibly good communication systems, do you think they're implementing your strategies right now? And if so, what does that look like concrete?
I think what they did when they were on their own defense, they're decentralized, they're empowering people to be on defense. But like I said, when you go on an offense, it's a lot tougher because you're on the move, as you know, and casualties start occurring, and leaders just got to pick up and take charge, understand the commander's intent 2 levels, 3 levels up, and then your whole chain of command. That's why the IDF is fascinating to study. And they've gone back to mission command. In the 2003 invasion of Lebanon, they were totally beaten by the Hezbollah because it was all top down, technologically supported, and then they realized that's not going to work. So we got to go back to where we're empowering leaders to make decisions. We're developing people to take charge when the leader goes up above them and continue to do something. I think because the Ukrainian army was always offspread of the Russian army. And the Russian army, even before the communists took over in 1917, was a top down organization. I mean, there's one little example of even in World War II, they were a top down organization that just had mass and they practiced maneuver warfare at the operational level. But on any given day, even in 1945, the Germans could beat them for a short period of time. But the way the Ukrainians are trying to do these colonels at their center of, they call it center of peace in Lvov. But what they're trying to do is implement these ideals. And if they have questions, they email me. So I don't know what's going to happen with the Ukrainians or the Taiwanese. I know the Taiwanese will be largely on the defense. And when you decentralize the defense at certain levels, you largely produce what happened when the Russians invaded the first week in February of 2022 against the Ukrainians. They just get the crap destroyed. And when they tried to do that air landing at the Kiev airport, that reaction was decentralization on part of the Ukrainians. You know, they had people on the ground that saw what was happening in air defense systems and counterattack forces and everything else, and they did it. But to transition that over to a major offense is going to take a lot of cultural changes, and I don't know if they're there yet.
You talked about some mental health challenges. How did you get the impact on your brain, the concussions? How did you get that diagnosed so that other people can learn from it?
So I was laissez-faire about when I retired in 2005. I had everything, but my wife had already been complaining to me about having temper issues, being frustrated easily, all the other little symptoms. It started out was I was at the National Training Center in 87 through 1990. And half of that time I was observer controller on the live fire team. Sam, where we did brigade level live fires with artillery. And I was a scout observer controller, the chief of the scout observer. So I was always forward. And I was near missed to the point where when I left the team to go to be the commander of the opposing forces recon company, they gave me a little plaque with shell fragments all over it, and said no one has survived near misses more than Don has. And some of those were major concussions. So I think it started there. And then I was in Desert Storm, of course, or Positive Force, and they were blowing up stuff all the time. And I was close to some of that. And then I also was an athlete. I played rugby and dirt bike raced and boxed. So I took some blows to the head a few times. So that has all accumulating effect as we're studying NFL players now. It's just like not one event and then it goes away. It's a cumulative effect. I basically crashed and burned in the summer of 2021. I was suffering from depression and severe anxiety, and my wife and I sat down and figured out a plan to get by financially, and we also started getting with the VA and getting more support. And then, fortunately, because I'm a retiree, I also have TRICARE Prime and all that stuff. And we started reading everything about it, and I started getting help and getting referrals. And I did a lot of MRIs in the December and January of 2021 and 2022, and that's what they found. Nothing was permanent, like bad, but they could tell I had been through a lot of concussions. I never did anything violent, but you can't even deal with a change on the computer, and you start going nuts. So I did those tests. I did a lot of mental tests, and I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I got counseling, and I started taking medicine and slowly getting better. So now they've got a group forming at the therapy clinic I go to for veterans. They want me to come in and help out with it because the progress I've made in the last couple of years, they say it's been dramatic. Basically, where I never wanted to get out of bed, I never wanted to do anything. And then, like I told you in the email, I did attempt suicide a couple of times, and my wife talked me out of it once, and then the other time I was in my truck and it was just 90 something 8 degrees in the commuter parking lot. I had my Chihuahua Bruiser who passed away last year. I took him everywhere, and I had my 45 out, and so it was a culmination of events that day. I'd been turned down for 2 jobs, one in an interview, Then my wife and I had an argument, and she's been a credible support, but she gets frustrated. She said, "You're a total failure because you should have become a GS instead of a contractor. We'd be all right now." She's frustrated. So I drove to this parking lot, and I just got off the phone with another turn down on a job through Booz Island. And I'm like, I can't take this. And he was in the floor trying to stay cooled off because I had the windows down. He jumps up on, he's blind too. He's 18 years old and blind. He jumps up on the seat and in my lap and he stares right at me while I've got this pistol in my hand, like, "You're not going to do this to me." So I put the pistol down and I called the VA hotline and they talked to me for an hour or so. And after that, I started getting help. And I don't mind admitting this to people because I just lost a good friend Saturday night to suicide from mental health. And I had talked to him in August for a lengthy time, telling him what I had done to help out. And I thought he was doing it and he didn't. So I don't mind sharing this because I have nothing to be ashamed of.
No, really, really appreciate you sharing it. A lot of guys are going through something similar in the suicide crisis in the veteran communities. Atrocious. Thank you for sharing it. Last question. Are there a couple of books, a handful of books that have changed your life?
Well, yeah, the Maneuver Warfare Handbook by Bill Lynn, and we updated it last year. Both of us did. And then with Tim Jackson's help and one of my best cadets who was a Green Beret, Joe Bernard. And then Stormtroop Tactics by Bruce Goodmanson, Innovation in the German Army, 1914 to 1918, was another significant book that I read in grad school. And then Gerhard Scharnhorst and the Military Gazelle Shaft by Chuck White. Those are the three books that have had the biggest impact on my life.
How can people follow you and your work?
Just put Donald Vandergriff in Google. It comes up thousands of times. And then go to nemertes.com and you can see my profile there. And then go to what's called Special Tactics. They sell my books, versions of books in paperback. And I'm all over Amazon. Of course, there's a profile on there. So I'm easy. Just put Donald E. Vandergriff in any search and it'll come up hundreds of my articles and my books and everything. And then Nemertes handles my workshops because I've trained the whole company to use the methodology. And they like to say we're one of the few companies that what we sell. They're able to teach it themselves, so it works out great.
Don, really appreciate having you on.
I appreciate you having me. It's great to meet you, and thank you for allowing me to do this with you.
All right, it's a pleasure. Thank you. That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.